Today we're going to be looking at the Neoclassical Revolution, especially at the work of William Jevons and Carl Menger. Now, the Neoclassical Revolution is in quotations because it's been called a revolution in economic thought, but others have argued that it is actually more the same than different from the classical school. So we put that question mark there for your consideration. First, let's think about the economic context in which the Neoclassical Revolution occurs, the latter part of the 19th century. Economically, we've seen huge developments in the concentration and centralization of capital. We've changed from one of more or less competitive society to an increasingly monopolistic society in an economic sense. Now, a concentrated monopoly is much different from a competitive firm. It's internally hierarchical, and the modern corporation is the best example of that, where you see these huge office buildings with the special corner offices for the elite corporate executives, and then all kinds of other hierarchy developed within the corporation, just at the management level alone. Now, this monopoly sector, of course, coexisted with the competitive sector, but there was increasingly the dominant force was the monopoly sector. At the same time, you have the development of an international financial sector, which is also substantially concentrated, and that also emerged. You may remember that when we talked about earlier, when we talked about Marx and Lenin, that they described this process of concentration, centralization, concentration of banking, and so on as a key phenomenon, and that's simply the empirical reality. We would say that by the time we're looking at these neoclassical writers, that the purely competitive world of Smith was ending. Most, or many at least, of the major players in the economy were price makers, not just the price takers of our perfectly competitive model. We've talked earlier about the predecessors of the neoclassical utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, Jean-Baptiste Say, Nassau Senior, and Frederick Bastiat, and all these predecessors of the modern neoclassical writers disputed the labor theory of value that had been developed by the classical writers and focused instead on utility or use value, or the satisfaction derived from consuming a product. And they came up with a new solution to Smith's water-diamond paradox. Remember, Smith had argued that water is very vital, has a high use value, but is very cheap in terms of exchange value because it's everywhere. The diamonds, on the other hand, are not really all that useful, but they are very expensive. And he argued then that the reason for this paradox is that utility really isn't the determinant of the value of something, rather it's the labor time that it takes to make something, and that if water is pretty easily accessible everywhere, then it's going to be very cheap. If diamonds are very hard to find and mine and refine and shine up and so on, then they're going to be very expensive. But the marginal writers, the utilitarians, argued that by adding marginal analysis to this process, you can now explain why the marginal cost of something and the marginal utility of something are going to be a way to explain the water-diamond paradox. So that's sort of the background, both economically and sort of theoretically. And they wrote, these neoclassical economists wrote during the 1870s, and the three most famous ones are William Jevons, Carl Menger, and Leon Walras. And we're going to just maybe talk about Jevons and Menger today. So Jevons was born in 1835. So that puts him in the Corn Laws were still in place in England, but were going to end soon, about 10 years later. And he died the year before Karl Marx died. Marx died in 1883, and Jevons died in 1882. Well, he didn't really turn to studying economics until 1860. He published his famous Theory of Political Economy in 1871. He rejects all forms of the labor theory of value in his work, and he says simply, value depends entirely upon utility. The word value, so far as it can be correctly used, merely expresses the circumstance of its exchanging in a certain ratio for some other substance. And so we are really looking at a very superficial or surface level of analysis. Jevons completely rejected that there was a concrete reality to value, an objective measure of it that was separate from the market system. He therefore only really cares about prices, not some underlying value. And therefore he only really studied circulation, the circulation process, and abstracted from production. Not surprisingly then, there is no discussion of class relations in production at all. And so Jevons basically has his simple behavioral assumption, which is even simpler really than that of Bentham, and that is that people have two characteristics. They want things, and we don't judge that at all. They want things even if they're illicit, and they are rational, calculating maximizers. And he goes on to conclude that to maximize pleasure is the problem of economics. And so, for Jevons, you receive utility by consuming commodities, and the more you consume, the more utility or happiness or satisfaction you get from them. And he contrasts total utility with this concept of the final degree of utility, what we would call marginal utility today. He criticized previous utilitarians for focusing on the total, and he introduces the diminishing marginal utility of a commodity, and that becomes the key to understanding economics. The total utility is certainly just a function of the quantity of good that you consume, and as long as you add to your consumption, you'll add to your total utility. You'll keep consuming. This is, of course, a fairly limited way of looking at behavior and consumption. But Jevons at least notes that the consumption involves costs and trade-offs of good Y for good X, and so this is where the margin becomes especially important. The ratios of the marginal utilities of good X to Y and that of price of X to price of Y matter greatly. So if the ratio of the marginal utilities of two goods is greater than the price ratio of the two goods, then if you trade 1 unit of Y for 1 unit of X, then you would get more utility, and therefore you would change the bundle of commodities that you are purchasing. And so you're adjusting your buying and selling until all the ratios of marginal utility and price ratios are equal across all commodities. The marginal utility to price ratio, which is if you just reorganize those terms in the previous bullet point, you can say that the marginal utility to price ratio tells you how much additional utility the consumer would receive for $1 more worth of commodity X. So now we've monetized the utility by bringing in the price. So in conclusion, all the marginal utility to price ratios have to be equal, or trading will continue until they are. And so diminishing marginal utility is simply the decline in additional utility received over the span of possible purchases, and this therefore ensures that the trading process will occur and lead to stable consumer bundles, unless of course prices change, in which case there will be an further adjustment through a market process. He argues that the nature of wealth and value explained by these marginal utility to price relationships calls this the consideration of indefinitely small amounts of pleasure and pain. On the margin, you get a little bit more out of that 6th apple compared to a little bit more out of that 2nd beer. So this is very much like Bentham's lightning calculation of pain and pleasure, but with marginality added in, so that you're really looking at just at the margin where things are happening. Now, Jevons did not take this theory very far. He didn't go to a way of determining prices. He merely showed that people ordered their purchases to maximize utility. Now, he also makes a point that is quite important in our thinking about the world, and that is that interpersonal comparisons of utility are not possible. He says that one cannot know the mind of another, and so therefore there's no way you could say that your additional unit of satisfaction is somehow similar to or bigger or smaller than someone else's. That differs from some of the previous utilitarians. Bentham, for example, had argued, remember, for partial egalitarianism based on the common humanity of people. But the difficulty for any comparison is that pleasure is a purely individual subjective estimate. And I think this brings us back to this notion that atomistic, rational individualism is the primary philosophical foundation for modern day economics, or at least certainly for price theory. And the question is that really a good way of understanding the world? I'll leave that to you to consider. JEVONS goes on to explicitly reject any kind of class conflict, saying that it's a delusion. Now, I'm not quite sure what he meant by arguing that what he observed around him in the battles between workers and capitalists and between nations and so on, not clear how he could consider it a delusion, but he certainly felt that there was nothing fundamental about class conflict, and he argues that in economic affairs all men are brothers. And he says that even though we know that yes, in some sense all men are brothers, we're all people and so on and so forth, but in his view it goes back to the two assumptions that everybody wants stuff and everybody's a rational maximizer. Beyond that, there's really not much more to say. If that's the only commonality among people, people are fairly limited in their understanding who they are. Now, JEVONS also had some capital theory. He felt that returns are related to the time that production takes. He challenged Ricardo, saying that wages and profit are actually not inversely related necessarily. He thought there was no antagonism between capital and labor. He argues essentially that the wages that the worker receives are exactly what the equivalent value of what he produces after you take away the rent, taxes, and interest of capital. So he argues that wages are really payments for the value added by a person's labor to the production process, not simply a payment for subsistence. So here's a clear distinction between the neoclassical school and the classical school. You didn't have to be Karl Marx to argue that labor was driven down to a subsistence level. Adam Smith felt that way, Thomas Malthus felt that way, John Stuart Mill felt that way, David Ricardo certainly felt that way. So the idea that subsistence forms the target, in a sense, for wages is completely reversed in JEVONS' theory. And he argues instead here that wages, whatever they may be, are actually equal to the value that you add to the production process. We've seen some of this kind of discussion about issues today about the minimum wage. Some of the more conservative writers have argued that if you have young workers who are not particularly well skilled in the labor force, that if you have a minimum wage that's too high, that the employers will not hire them because what they add to the process is less than that minimum wage. So they argue for reducing the minimum wage or abolishing it altogether. That's the same kind of argument here, that somehow wages measure what you add to the production process. And this became, and still is today, sort of the central idea about wages in the modern capitalist economy. JEVONS goes on to argue that the accumulation of capital helped the worker, that capitalists are the group of people that actually sustain labor. If you didn't have the capitalists, then there would be no work, in his view. And so JEVONS felt that capital growth was very important, and he argues that even though much of what his work is about the science of exchange, he also thinks that the science of capitalization was critical. And that's enough for today. We'll be continuing this in our next video.